Tonight, I want to reveal something most people overlook, not because it's hidden, but because it's easy to miss when someone is skilled at pretending it isn't there. It's the emotional pattern that unfolds when avoidant individuals push empaths into silence. And why, in the very moment an avoidant thinks they've finally gained control, their inner world actually begins to destabilize. Avoidants and empaths sit on opposite ends of emotional experience. One feels everything with depth and intensity, while the other survives by shutting feelings down. One moves toward connection, the other steps back to preserve distance. At first, this contrast can feel strangely balanced, even attractive, like two different systems learning each other's rhythm. But over time, that balance turns into tension. The turning point in an avoidance emotional collapse doesn't begin when the empath leaves. It begins when the empath stops investing emotional energy. Because what the avoidant thought they were managing alone was actually being stabilized by the relationship dynamic itself. Avoidants don't simply avoid people, they avoid emotional experience. And the only reason they can maintain that distance without breaking down is because someone else is quietly absorbing the emotional weight. The empath becomes that support system without realizing it. Their patience, understanding, forgiveness, and emotional consistency act like a buffer that protects the avoidant from the consequences of their own detachment. As long as the empath keeps giving, the avoidant never has to confront what they're suppressing. Emptiness, fear, unresolved pain, and emotional disconnection buried beneath their distance. To the avoidant, the empath's emotional presence becomes something like oxygen, not acknowledged out loud, but deeply relied upon. It allows them to feel connected without vulnerability, safe without effort, important without emotional risk. The empath isn't just loving them, they are regulating their emotional world through understanding, persistence, and acceptance. But then something shifts. The empath becomes quiet, not angry, not cold, not retaliatory, just quiet. A silence that comes from exhaustion rather than emotion. A silence that quietly communicates, I can't carry this alone anymore. At first, the avoidant barely notices. They interpret it as temporary distance, something that will reset itself like before. But when the silence continues, something unfamiliar begins to surface. Instability. The internal structure they relied on, without ever acknowledging it, starts to feel unsteady. Their emotional regulation, which was subtly supported by the empath's presence, begins to weaken. Avoidants often believe their strength lies in emotional detachment. They equate distance with control and suppression with stability. They feel safest when nothing is being felt too deeply. But when the empath goes silent, that same distance transforms into something else entirely. Emptiness, the very protection they depended on, becomes isolation. For the first time, there is no emotional energy coming in to soften their internal world. No empathic presence absorbing their avoidance. No warmth filling the spaces they've learned to ignore. And what remains is everything they've avoided for years. All of it begins to surface at once, with nowhere left to be redirected. Their emotional defenses start to crack, not loudly, but quietly under pressure. And the experience is not immediate chaos. It's quiet discomfort, a growing awareness of absence. They begin to feel what they once dismissed. They start to miss what they pretended wasn't necessary. They feel regret slowly forming through silence itself, because silence changes meaning when it is no longer under their control. For years, avoidants used silence as protection. It is their way of regulating emotion, avoiding vulnerability, and restoring a sense of control when closeness feels overwhelming. And it worked, because the empath always filled it. Whenever the avoidant pulled away, the empath reached in. Whenever distance appeared, the empath closed it. Whenever silence grew, the empath responded with presence, care, and emotional effort. So the avoidant learned a false equation. Silence equals power. But everything changes when the empath no longer plays that role. When the empath finally goes silent, it is not because they stopped feeling. It is because they reached their limit. Because continuing to speak into emotional emptiness eventually breaks something inside them. And when that happens, they withdraw, not to punish, but to preserve themselves. This kind of silence is different. It carries boundaries, clarity, finality. And that is the moment the avoidance perception collapses. The silence they once used as control now becomes something they cannot control at all. It no longer feels empowering. It feels threatening, heavy, unfamiliar, final. Because now there is no one filling the gap they created. No one softening the impact of their emotional distance. No one restoring connection after withdrawal. And without that presence, they are left alone with the very emotions they spent years avoiding. The silence becomes louder than anything they ever escaped, louder than conflict, louder than emotion, louder than denial. And this time, they didn't choose it. That is what makes it unbearable. Because avoidants can control their own withdrawal, but they cannot control when someone stops returning. And that loss of control triggers something deeper than discomfort. It triggers emotional recognition, the realization that the person they pushed away mattered more than they admitted. For years, they believed silence made them strong. But the empath's silence reveals something entirely different. The strength was never in withdrawal. It was in the ability to stay open, to stay present, to keep trying, and to keep loving even when it wasn't returned equally. When the empath finally stops reaching, the avoidant is forced into the one place they have always avoided. No buffer, no emotional regulator, no external stability. Just everything they buried rising to the surface at once. And in that stillness, they discover something they never wanted to see clearly. Their silence was never strength. It was escape. And now, when that escape no longer works, they are left facing the full weight of themselves, without anything left to run from it. Their coping style is not something that appears out of nowhere. It is something shaped early in life, reinforced through unresolved childhood wounds, and carried into adulthood like an invisible layer of protection. Over time, it becomes an emotional armor they don't even consciously question. And as long as the empath keeps speaking, explaining, loving, forgiving, and trying to maintain the connection, the avoidant is never forced to turn inward. They don't have to sit with their fears. They don't have to question their emotional distance. They don't have to confront the insecurity hidden beneath their detachment. Instead, they can project, justify, deny, and rationalize, because the empath's emotional presence keeps the entire dynamic functioning. Suddenly, there is no one left to stand between the avoidant and themselves. No emotional noise, no soothing voice, no reassurance, no presence absorbing the weight of their withdrawal. No one repairing what they break through distance. All the explanations disappear. All the emotional cushioning is gone. The entire system they relied on to stay regulated starts to collapse. And when that external emotional support vanishes, the avoidant is pushed into something they have spent years avoiding: themselves. A confrontation with their inner world, with the fears they buried, with the emotional wounds they never processed, with the insecurities they disguised as independence, and with the uncomfortable truth that they are not as detached as they pretend to be. Avoidants often fear their inner world more than they fear losing relationships. That is the real reason they withdraw. As long as the empath remains present, offering warmth, patience, forgiveness, and emotional consistency, the avoidant can stay distant without consequence. The empath becomes an emotional buffer, a stabilizer they never acknowledge but deeply rely on. But silence changes everything. It removes the distraction. It removes the emotional noise. It removes the illusion that avoidance is harmless. And suddenly, the feelings they suppressed begin to rise. Fear, loneliness, guilt, longing, regret, confusion, abandonment, emotional hunger that was never. They cannot call it space anymore, because now that space feels empty, not freeing. They cannot call it independence anymore, because what remains doesn't feel like independence at all. It feels like loss, and in that emptiness, a deeper truth surfaces. They were never truly running from the empath. They were running from their own emotional vulnerability. And now, that vulnerability has caught up with them. And for the first time, they begin to understand something they avoided for years. The empath's presence was not pressure. It was stability. And now that stability is gone. This is the internal collapse begins. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally. Quietly, inside the mind, where thoughts, memories, guilt, and unresolved emotions begin to collide. They start to realize the empath was not just a partner in the dynamic. They were the emotional anchor that kept everything from drifting apart. And now that anchor is gone. What remains is drift, uncertainty, internal noise they can no longer silence. This is why silence becomes the breaking point, because silence doesn't just remove the empath's voice. And when excuses disappear, there is nowhere left to hide. They are left with themselves, without buffering, without avoidance, without emotional insulation. And that is the confrontation they have spent a lifetime avoiding. The avoidant always expected pursuit. They never expected peace. They were conditioned to believe emotional imbalance would always correct itself through the other person's effort. Withdraw and be followed. Shut down and be repaired. Pull away and be pursued. That cycle becomes their definition of safety because it allows them to feel wanted without having to be emotionally available in return. But then something breaks that expectation. The empath stops chasing. Just quiet. Not bitter, not chaotic, not reactive. Just calm, steady silence. And that silence changes everything. This silence is different. A truth the avoidant was never prepared to hear. I've accepted reality. You don't know how to show up. And that quiet acceptance hits harder than any argument ever could, because arguments still mean engagement. Tears still mean emotional investment. Questions still mean hope. Even conflict still means the bond exists in some form. Peace means they are no longer trying to revive what was repeatedly neglected. Peace means they are no longer emotionally tied to the avoidant's presence for stability. Peace means the empath has reached a place where they no longer need them. And that is what destabilizes the avoidant. Not anger, not confrontation, not blame, but emotional absence wrapped in calm. Because the avoidant's sense of identity has often been quietly reinforced by being pursued, chosen, and emotionally prioritized, even while they themselves gave very little in return. As long as someone was chasing them, they never had to face the deeper fear underneath everything. If no one is reaching for me, do I still matter? That question remains buried as long as pursuit continues. But peace removes pursuit entirely, and what replaces it is not chaos, it is stillness. In that stillness, the avoidant realizes something they never expected. They didn't lose control, they lost significance. They lost emotional importance in someone who once centered them. Because it exposes a dependency they refused to acknowledge. The silent reliance on someone else's emotional effort to validate their presence. They began to see that what they called strength was never self-sustained. It was supported, reinforced, and softened by the empath's patience, forgiveness, and emotional endurance. It was borrowed stability, not independent strength. And now that support is gone. There is no one filling the silence, no one absorbing the distance, no one compensating for emotional absence. Peace becomes exposure. It removes blame. It removes distraction. It removes the emotional noise that used to soften accountability. And in that exposure, a truth rises that the avoidant cannot escape. They are alone, not because the empath never cared, but because they never learned how to stay present when it mattered. That realization marks the beginning of internal collapse. Not loud, not dramatic, but quiet and persistent, unfolding inside the mind where denial slowly stops working. Because for years, the avoidant believed distance was protection. They believed shutting down kept them safe. They believed emotional withdrawal preserved control. But silence reveals the opposite. It shows that distance did not protect the connection. It weakened it. It eroded it. It slowly dismantled what could have been stable. And when the empath finally stops participating in the cycle, all illusions break at once. The idea that they will always come back. The belief that love will persist regardless of effort. All of it dissolves in silence. Because the empath's silence is not confusion. It is not manipulation. It is not emotional reaction. It is conclusion. It is what remains after repeated disconnection, ignored effort, and emotional depletion. And that is what makes it irreversible. The avoidant begins to understand, often too late, that what they interpreted as patience was actually endurance. And endurance always has a limit. The empath did not leave in a moment. They left gradually, long before the silence became visible. Each unanswered moment, each dismissed feeling, each unmet need contributed to the distance that now feels sudden. And now, in that silence, memory begins to shift. And most importantly, the avoidant begins to recognize something they avoided seeing. They were loved in a way they did not know how to receive. Not because the love was lacking, but because their emotional defenses kept them from staying open to it. And that distinction is what hurts the most, because it removes the external explanation. There is no longer someone to blame, no longer a situation to justify, no longer a narrative that protects the ego. Only responsibility remains, and responsibility without avoidance becomes overwhelming. This is where collapse deepens, not in action, but in awareness. They realize they didn't lose the empath because love wasn't there. They lost the empath because they repeatedly stepped away from it. Not once, not accidentally, but consistently through emotional withdrawal and avoidance. And silence makes that impossible to ignore, because now there is no response left to distort reality, no reassurance to soften consequences, no emotional exchange to reset the cycle, just stillness and the truth inside it. The empath's silence becomes a mirror. They see for the first time without distortion that the relationship did not fail because love was absent. It failed because presence was inconsistent, and that realization carries weight because it cannot be undone. Not because the empath stopped caring, but because caring alone was never enough to sustain something that required mutual emotional participation. And in that understanding, something final becomes clear. The connection did not collapse in a moment of silence. It collapsed over time through repeated emotional absence. Silence simply revealed what was already gone. And now, the avoidant is left with the full impact of that truth, without escape, without distraction, and without the emotional buffer they once depended on. Just themselves, and everything they never learned how to face. In the end, the collapse is not about one moment of silence. It is about everything that led to it. The empath's quiet doesn't destroy the avoidant. It reveals what was already broken. It removes the emotional support they were unknowingly relying on and exposes the truth they spent years avoiding. Without pursuit, without reassurance, and without emotional cushioning, the avoidant is left alone with themselves and with the realization that distance was never strength, only delay. And the final truth becomes unavoidable. The relationship didn't end because love was absent, but because fear kept getting in the way of receiving it.